A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In a previous interview, the rabbi stated that on Tisha B'Av, one should say the more authentic nusach of Rachem as opposed to Nachem. Among the reasons the rabbi gave was the false description of Jerusalem as being desolate and uninhabited in the commonly used nusach of Nachem. A viewer has made the claim that the part of Jerusalem which was known as Jerusalem back in the time that the bracha was created, that is, the areas in close proximity to Har Bayit, is indeed desolate and uninhabited, when one takes into account how these areas of modern Jerusalem are inhabited by large numbers of hostile Arabs. Does the rabbi have any comments?
Before dealing with some of the claims against making this change, supposed change, to the nusach of Tisha, that is said on Tisha B'Av, I wish to first mention the basic and fundamental fact that it is in fact those who say Nahem, the nusach that begins with the word Nahem on Tisha B'Av, it is actually those people who are going against what Chazal taught us and instructed us explicitly, and they are the ones who, in fact, who have made the change. Because the simple fact is as follows, that it states in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and I quote, this is in Masechet Taniyot, Perek Sheni, and the same appears also in Masechet Berachot. It says, Rabbi Aha, Bar Yishak, B'Shem Rabbi Hiya, Rabada Sipurin. It was stated in the name of Rabbi Hiya, the following halakha. This is a purely halachic statement that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is not contested by the Talmud Bavli, and which is in fact brought by all the Rishonim and the Geonim as being a requirement and a halachic statement without any mahloket. It says as follows: Yahid b'Tisha B'Av, the individual, even the individual on Tisha B'Av is required, Sarich Lazkir Ma'in HaMeorah, he's required to mention the fact that today is Tisha B'Av, and therefore to mention what Tisha B'Av is all about. Why are we mourning and commemorating this day? He is required to say this in his tefillah, in the Shmon Esrei. And the Yerushalmi goes on to state and give us the precise nusach. It says, what do you say? U'mahu omer, Rahem Adonai Eloheinu b'rahamecha rabim u'v'hasadecha ne'amonim alenu v'al Yisrael amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha, etc., etc. The nusach is quite a few lines in length. And it's important to note that here we have one of the few examples where the entire nusach that one says on a particular day of the year, a particular part of the tefillah that we say regularly is mentioned, is quoted directly in full by the Talmud. In other words, we do not have in the Talmud or in the Mishnah or any other Tanaic or Amoraic source, we do not have the text of, for example, Birkot Kriyat Shema, the brachot that we say with Kriyat Shema, which are one of the most basic parts of the tefillah. We do not have in the Talmud or the Mishnah the precise and full text of the Shmon Esrei. We have only a description, a general description, and some basic guidelines as to the configuration of the tefillah, but we do not have the exact nusach. We do not have the precise nusach for Birkat HaMazon in the Talmud or the Mishnah, etc., etc. That is the norm. The norm is that Chazal tell us there is a certain tefillah or bracha that needs to be said, where there are certain guidelines, parameters, and requirements. These are mentioned, that one has to say this and one must not say that, but the exact nusach, the precise text that one is expected to say, is not mentioned. And yet we are very, very careful, all of us are very careful to use a specific text and not to, without very, very convincing and cogent reasons, we do not make any change to that text. Here, in the case of Tisha B'Av, the situation is reversed. Here we have one of the rare examples of the entire nusach that we are required to say on a certain day, the entire additional tefillah that we add to the Shemona Esrei, is mentioned clearly and in full, word for word, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. This statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi is quoted in Seder of Amram Gaon, it is quoted in the Rif, it is later quoted in all the Rishonim, such as the Rambam and the Rosh, etc. Even though it's true in some of those sources, like the Rif, and particularly the Rosh, the nusach was tampered with and deliberately censored in order to make it fit more closely that which appears in most Sidurim, but it is clear that it is the original nusach of the Yerushalmi that is being quoted, as we have explained in the past. And what we find in practice, surprisingly and almost ludicrously, is that dafka, where we find the exact nusach handed down to us clearly, word for word, in the Talmud, it is precisely on this occasion that most Jews ignore that nusach and choose, for whatever reason, to say another nusach, the authorship of which is unclear. No one knows who wrote the nusach which begins with the word Nahem. It seems clear that it was written at some point during the time of the Geonim. We do not know by whom, and even then, in those sources where this nusach is quoted, the very few sources that one might add where it is quoted, such as in the Or Zarua, it is mentioned there as an alternate nusach to be said during Minha, on the assumption that during Arvith and Shaharith of Tisha B'Av, one did say the authentic and original nusach as quoted, as handed down in the Talmud Yerushalmi. So one could ask, why change for Mincha? And that's a very valid question, and it's clear that most of the Rishonim were opposed to this notion. But at least one said the original nusach during Arvith and Shaharith, which is also as it should be. In other words, as we have mentioned, this nusach should be said during all the tefillot of Tisha B'Av, as the Rosh writes explicitly, for example. So here we have the paradoxical situation of where we are actually given the nusach word for word. Most of us are deliberately ignoring this nusach and choosing, for some reason, to say another nusach, and that itself is very strange, to put it mildly. And therefore we're talking about an halachic requirement to say something, and we are told exactly what to say, and people in fact are doing something else, not saying that which the Talmud told them to say. And according to the claim of most halachic Jews, Orthodox Jews, who claim that they follow the halakha and they follow halachic requirements, it is very difficult to explain this behavior. Why that which the Talmud explicitly tells you to do, you do not do, but you choose of your own volition to say something else. That is one reason, and that's the most fundamental reason why one should say the nusach that appears in the Yerushalmi, with the very minor changes that I mentioned. In other words, instead of concentrating on the city, Ha'ir Ha'avela, because the nusach of Rahim, as it appears in the Yerushalmi, speaks about Ha'ir Ha'avela, Ha'harusa, Ha'shomema, the city which is in mourning, which is destroyed, which is desolate, instead of focusing on the city, which of course today is not so. The version that I suggest, which is based entirely on the Yerushalmi, simply changes the city for the har, for the mountain, for the temple mount. So we speak about Machon Mikdash and Ha'ar, Ha'avel, Ha'harus, Ha'shomem, etc. And the mountain, of course, Har HaBayit, of course, is in ruins from a Torah perspective, and that which is supposed to be there is not there, and that which most certainly should not be there is there, and that, of course, can be correctly described as a shemama, as desolation. So those are the essential facts, and that is why one should say that particular nusach with those very minor changes, and that is, as we have mentioned, the nusach that appears in almost every single halachically authoritative source from the time of the Geonim and down through all the Rishonim. Now, some people make the claim that how can one make a change to the nusach? Wasn't this nusach instituted by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, for example? This is clearly a ludicrous claim. We do not even have the exact nusach of the Shemona Esrei that Anshe Knesset Hagdolah instituted. As we said before, we only have the basic structure and format of that tefillah, and we know a few of the hathimot, the way some of those brachot end, is given to us explicitly in some of the early sources, like the Talmud, like the Tosefta, etc., the Mishnah. But the exact nusach, the exact wording of the Shemona Esrei, which is the most central of all our tefillot, word for word. We do not have anywhere in the Talmud or the Mishnah or in any other source from Chazal. To claim that the nusach of Rahem, or even worse, to claim that the nusach of Nahem, which was clearly a later invention, is from the time of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, is clearly ludicrous. That would be suggesting, therefore, that Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, hundreds of years before these events, instituted a tefillah to be said on that day at some future time, describing a reality which had not yet occurred. To Hagaon Harav Haim David Halevi Zatzal, in his book Aselach Harav, the second volume, he has a number of answers to people who asked him similar questions regarding his suggestion about how to modify the nusach for Tisha B'Av, and this is one of the claims that was made. And he, of course, rejected this claim out of hand, as we have just done here. It is also obvious from the fact that the tefillah, this additional tefillah for Tisha B'Av of Rahem, quoted in the Talmud Yerushalmi and later quoted by all the Rishonim, is brought in the name of Rabbi Hiyah. This itself is proof that it was not written by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. That which was instituted by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah is not brought in the name of an Amorah by the name of Rabbi Hiyah. That is something which does not happen and could never happen. So such a way of thinking, such an approach is quite ludicrous, and no serious person could consider such a notion seriously. There is another point which needs to be stressed here, and that is that Tisha B'Av is still today, even in our present reality, which is infinitely better in every way than the situation has been for the Jewish people since the time of the height of Beit Rishon, since the time of David HaMelech or Shlomo HaMelech. Nevertheless, the essential fact is that we do not have a mikdash at the present time. We do not have a proper form of political leadership for the Jewish people in our country, and there are many other fundamental problems from which we suffer. And for all these things, we mourn and we pray for the situation to be improved and to be changed in a very significant and fundamental way. And therefore Tisha B'Av is still very relevant. No one is claiming that Tisha B'Av is not relevant. It is true that the situation is far better than it was. It has never been this good, in fact, for a very, very long time. And yet, as long as the Geula is not Shalema, as long as our redemption is not complete, as long as there are still things that we require, that we feel, that we know clearly are missing in our reality, we still must fast and mourn on this day, and we must say the tefillah on this day that we are required to say, without, of course, speaking lies before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without being dover shikarim b'fnei Hashem. And therefore we should say the Nusach of the Yerushalmi with very minor modifications.
And what about the claim that the tefillah refers to the old city and the environs?
The claim that the tefillah refers only to the old city and therefore is as relevant as before is also very strange and bespeaks a lack of historical knowledge and awareness. First of all, one has to keep in mind that even in ancient times, even the time of Beit Rishon, the first temple period, and certainly the time of the second temple, there were many non-Jews, particularly in the time of the second temple, there were many non-Jews living throughout the country, and also very near to Yerushalayim, and even within Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim under Roman rule, even before the destruction, before the Great Revolt, and before the Churban, the destruction of the Mikdash and the city, Yerushalayim was not only a Jewish city. There were plenty of non-Jews in Yerushalayim. There was plenty of non-Jewish influence in Yerushalayim. In fact, there were major Roman monuments and military camps and headquarters, in fact, literally abutting Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount itself. The claim, therefore, that the presence of non-Jews, idol worshippers, etc., people who worship false gods, in and around the Temple Mount area is sufficient reason to go on speaking about Yerushalayim being desolate and being harev, being destroyed, and being in mourning, being avel, as the tefillah that most people say speaks of Yerushalayim. It speaks of Yerushalayim being Ha'ir Ha'avela, Ha'harusa V'Shomema. Was Yerushalayim in the time of Beit Sheni, when this was also the case, when many non-Jews of that type lived in and around Yerushalayim? Was such a claim ever made? Did anyone ever suggest that Yerushalayim during the Second Temple period was in mourning? Did anyone ever suggest that Yerushalayim or the Jewish people were mourning the reality as if it was some kind of total disaster? No. Everyone understood that the situation was far from perfect, but no one in their right mind would ever suggest that Yerushalayim at the time of Beit Sheni was in mourning, or that it was desolate and there were no Jews there, even though there were many non-Jews, but there certainly were Jews, as there are today. Today, in the area around Har HaBayit, near to and further away from Har HaBayit, there are many Jews, including in the Old City, and therefore such claims are simply quite impossible to comprehend. Furthermore, those who claim that the tefillah refers only to the Old City, I would ask them, first of all, how do you know this? You must provide some proof for what you're saying. And second of all, I would ask them, when you say the Old City, what do you mean? Do you mean the city as defined by the present walls of the Old City of Jerusalem? In that case, what significance, what Jewish significance, halachic significance is there to those walls? Those walls that stand today were built 500 odd years ago by Suleiman the Great, an Ottoman emperor, and they have no halachic or Jewish significance at all. They do not describe Yerushalayim of the time of the second Mikdash or the first Mikdash or any period of Jewish sovereignty. It was the city as defined for whatever reason, for whatever purpose, by the Ottoman foreign rulers who ruled this in this part of the world 500 odd years ago. There is no significance, therefore, to speaking about the Old City as opposed to the New City. The wall, essentially, from our point of view, is an irrelevance. Furthermore, if one does speak about the Old City, there are many Jews who live in the Old City of Jerusalem, to the east of Har HaBayit, to the west of Har HaBayit, to the north and to the south, both very close in close proximity to Har HaBayit and slightly further away, whether it's a kilometer or 2 kilometers away. There are hundreds of thousands of Jews living within a couple of kilometers of Har HaBayit in all directions. To claim otherwise is simply spurious, and therefore all such discussion to me is, I would say, essentially nonsensical. A further point that should be made is that the Nusach in Yerushalmi, quoted in the name of Rabbi Haya, describes the reality in Yerushalayim and the environs in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt. It is well known that the Romans, in the wake of that revolt, when it was finally put down, rebuilt Yerushalayim as a Roman city. They did not allow Jews to live anywhere in Yerushalayim or near Yerushalayim. That the entire southern part of the country, in fact, was officially declared Judenrein, and all the Jews that remained in the country after the revolt were forced to live in the north, in the Galil, and later in the Golan. No one was allowed to live essentially south of Bnei Brak, shall we say. That was the southernmost point, more or less, where Jews lived in that period. So that Yerushalayim at that time was literally Avela, was in mourning. It had become an entirely Gentile city without any Jewish presence. On Har HaBayit you had a temple to Jupiter, the Roman god, instead of a temple to Hashem. There were no Jews allowed to live in Yerushalayim or anywhere near Yerushalayim, so it literally was Shomema mi bli baneha. It was without and me'en yoshev. There were no Jewish inhabitants. All that description, therefore, was entirely accurate for that time. To speak about this still being the case, when even within the old city of Yerushalayim and the areas adjacent to the old city, you have hundreds of thousands of Jews, to make such a claim is clearly ludicrous and clearly false, misrepresents the reality, and also represents a great lack of gratitude and lack of understanding as to what Hashem has given us in this generation. It is very much like a son who has grown, has become a man, is an adult in his own right, and continues to live in his parents' home, and they continue to support him and provide him with almost everything that he has. And he turns around one day and says to his father, you do nothing for me, you give me nothing. How would such a father feel if he were accused of such a thing by his son who lives under his roof, whom he supports? This is exactly the situation that this is the kind of claim that we hear today made by certain people, and it is a terrible, terrible thing to be so lacking in hakarat hatov vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when our situation today, despite the problems, is infinitely better than it was in almost any period in the last nearly 3,000 years. Even during the time of the first temple, when, as we know from the Tanakh explicitly, the city of Yerushalayim was covered in sites to Avodah Zarah, for idol worship, quite literally idol worship, and the streets of Yerushalayim and the city and the environs of Yerushalayim became a huge center of Avodah Zarah, particularly during the time of Menashe HaMelech. Never did anyone suggest that Yerushalayim was a city in mourning. No, never did anyone suggest it was a desolate city, etc. In other words, these facts, as deplorable and lamentable as they are and were, nevertheless never would have led anyone to suggest that Yerushalayim be described in such a way. The word galuth and the word shemama and the term aveluth, etc., are only mentioned when the Jewish people are physically removed from their birthright, from their homeland. And this also is part of the response to those who claim that when you look around Yerushalayim, or you look around Israel in general today, and you see the shemama ruhanith, the spiritual wilderness in which we exist, and there is of course some truth to that claim, even though there's also much that is positive, and there is also many fields in which, spiritually speaking, the Jewish people are advancing. But yes, there is also much spiritual desolation and wilderness around us. The claim that this is what we refer to in the tefillah of Nahem or Rahem, and therefore it can still be said as before, this too is an entirely spurious claim. If in the time of Menashe, when Yerushalayim was a seat of Avodah Zarah, that was deliberately and actively promoted by the king, by the monarchy, by the state, even if at that time Yerushalayim was not described in such terms, how could anyone describe Yerushalayim or Israel today in such terms? This also has to do with that particular point of view, that particular hashkafa, that is to say a Haredi hashkafa, that refuses to look at the facts on the ground and the physical and political, sociological, historical realities, and always tries to sublimate everything and turn everything into something spiritual and philosophical. The tefillah of Rahem is not referring to the spiritual aspects of the city or the Jewish people. It is referring to the physical destruction and the physical desolation and the political reality on the ground in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Churban and the generations following the Churban and the generations following the Bar Kokhba revolt, etc. And as long as that situation was in evidence, that nusach was entirely correct. And even when many Jews returned to these areas in different parts of Eretz Yisrael, whether it be in Yerushalayim or in Tzfat or in other parts of the country, even when Jews do return to some of these parts of the land, when the country is still under non-Jewish occupation, when it is still being ruled by foreigners, the country and those areas can still be referred to as being in a state of Hurban, because much depends on the political situation, the political reality. Who is in fact the sovereign power? Who is the ruler on the ground de facto? This is not some newfangled idea. This idea appears in the Bet Yosef and in the Bach in Siman Tau Kof Samech Aleph, referring to the bracha that one says about parts of the country in which Jews do or do not live. There is a certain statement and bracha that one has to say, and there the Bet Yosef and the Bach make this point. To clarify to what I refer, I will quote briefly from the Tur, Siman Tau Kof Samech Aleph, B'chot Tisha B'Av. The Tur brings the halacha and says, Haro'eh Arei Yisrael, he who sees Jewish towns, Jewish settlements, b'hurbanan, in their destruction, in the state of destruction. Omer, al harishona shero'eh, when he sees the first of these towns or cities in a state of destruction, he says, he says, he quotes a certain pasuk and tears and rends his garment, his clothing. And then when he goes on to see Yerushalayim itself, he says, Sion midbar hayatha, Yerushalayim shemama v'korea, etc. The Beth Yosef relates to this halakha, and he writes as follows. There are two possible explanations, or ways of understanding what is being said here. The first, he says, is as follows. The first approach would be to say that we're talking about Jewish towns or cities or settlements where Jews used to live, and then were destroyed by this or that group of non-Jews and foreign conquerors, etc. And they are still desolate because they have not yet been rebuilt. The Jews have not resettled those areas. وَأَنْ بَهِمْ يِشُوْ كْلَالٍ, says the Beth Yosef, and therefore they are desolate, literally. But if they have in fact been resettled, even though they are ruled by non-Jews, in other words, even though the ruling power is a non-Jewish, foreign and occupying power, it would seem perhaps that in that situation we are not required to tear our garments and to make these statements. That's the first option. The second option, says the Beit Yosef, is to understand this halakha differently and to say, as long as those parts of the country to which we refer are under the control, the political control of a non-Jewish ruling power, even though there are Jews who live there today, they are still considered to be in a state of hurban, of destruction, because he who rules the actual physical, political reality, the historical, political, not the spiritual reality, but the reality on the ground, the question as to who controls what goes on in this piece of territory, who raises taxes, who calls the shots, who makes the laws, etc. That question is the ikar, says the Beit Yosef, and he's posek this way. Halakha, he says v'chen ikar, and that is the more correct interpretation. In other words, even though we are talking about a part of the country that was once destroyed, shall we say, by the Romans, and in the interim, many Jews have returned to that part of the land and have rebuilt some cities or towns and live there today, if it is still under foreign rule, then it is still considered to be in a state of hurban, and this baracha, or this statement, and the kri'ah, the rending of the garment, still needs to be done. And the Bah, in his Perush, writes as follows. He says, Ufashuthu, Dahai Are Yehuda b'hurbanan de kamar hainu afilu yesham yishuv. The Bach doesn't even countenance the first interpretation. He says it is obvious and plain and clear that even if there are Jews who live in these parts of the country, as long as they are ruled by non-Jews, afilu yesham yishuv, kol sheyad ha'umoth sholetet alo, even though, as long as non-Jews rule over that area, b'hurbanan mikri. In other words, we see that the political, historical reality on the ground is what we are referring to in all these halachot that have to do with Yerushalayim and the Hurban and everything related to it. And the same is true for this tefillah of Rahem that we say on Tisha B'Av. The fact that the political reality on the ground has changed, not as much as it should have, not as much as we would like. And yes, it's also true that much of our present problems and the deficiencies in the present reality are self-inflicted. In other words, we could very easily change that reality. Despite all of that, the fact is that when there were riots yesterday morning on Har HaBayit, on Tisha B'Av, it was the Israeli police force that put an end to it. Of course, the riot should never have taken place in the first place, and of course those Arabs shouldn't be on Har HaBayit to begin with, and many other things should not be. But the fact is that when there was a riot, it was ended, and peace was restored, even probably only for a short time until the next riot, by the Israeli police force. That is an halachically significant and very meaningful reality, and this has everything to do with the tefillah of Rahem that we say, and therefore we cannot speak about a city that is in mourning or a city that is destroyed or desolate. We can speak about Har HaBayit, which is desolate, which is empty of what it should contain, and which is full of things it should not contain, and we can definitely mourn and lament the situation in the country today in many respects, and the lack of political vision and strength and willpower of the present government in this country, and many governments before it, who could, if they were of a mind to, who could change the reality for the better. And yet, our situation is very far from the reality described in the original version of the Tefillah of Rahim, and very far from the reality that has existed for most of the last 2,000 or even 2,500 years, and therefore we also have much to rejoice about and much to be thankful for, and therefore we also have to be careful to be very precise in our tefillot and say exactly what we mean and mean exactly what we say.
Is the opposition to modifying the Nusach part of a broader agenda?
Yes, indeed, this is the hidden aspect of this whole discussion. Very often we hear different claims, such as this refers to the old city of Yerushalayim, or speaking about the spiritual shmama, the desolation, and things of this nature, as we have discussed. But in fact, the truth of the matter is that the opposition to any change to the Nusach said on Tisha B'Av is first and foremost an hashkafic opposition. It is based on an ideology and a philosophy of Judaism, that is to say, that nothing can ever change. Everything in Judaism, absolutely everything, is and must always be immutable, no matter what. And only on that basis is it clear and obvious to these people that no change is possible, no change or modification is to be countenanced. And then they begin to search for the specific arguments and claims that they will present in order to support this position that they hold. The truth is, any discussion of change, even the concept of Tisha B'Av being avoided altogether, as Zechariah HaNavi himself states will be the case in the future, even that is perceived, if certain people were to be honest about it, even that is perceived as a threat to what they consider to be standard Judaism, because for many people Judaism includes a day called Tisha B'Av when you do this and you don't do that and you say certain things, and any change at all to that order of reality is a threat. And this, of course, can be traced back to the famous words of the Hatam Sofer over 200 years ago, when in response to the reform movement in Germany, which was obviously a very negative and pernicious movement, which did not aim to strengthen Judaism, but rather to weaken it, in order to make it more palatable, shall we say, to the German Gentile of the day, and to make the Jews more palatable to them. In dealing with this kind of opposition, the Hatam Sofer came up with the witticism based on a certain halachic concept, hadash asur min haTorah, that anything that is new is to be forbidden, is to be prohibited. This was never, in fact, the true spirit of the Torah, and the Hatam Sofer knew this very well. He meant to say that in my time, today, in this place, in this time, in this historical, at this historical juncture, we must not make any changes. And that was a very reasonable position in his particular set of circumstances. But in general, when certain realities change, particularly with regards to the kind of changed historical reality to which we refer in this discussion, it has always been the case that things do change and must change. That is why the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Het stresses that all the four fast days will eventually become days of celebration, and 3 of the 4 fast days, that is to say the others, with the exception of Tisha B'Av, even in less than ideal conditions, can be considered to be reshut, can be considered to be optional and not obligatory. This is what the Talmud states in the Talmud Bavli Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Het. So the status of such days and what one says on such days has always been part of the Torah, always been part of the halachic process, but the position espoused by many people nowadays is one based on the ideology that became the slogan, as it were, of orthodoxy 200 years ago. Orthodoxy itself being an invention which was invented in order to deal with the threat of Reform Judaism, and that slogan has unfortunately blinded people to the fact that Judaism is not first and foremost about being immutable in every jot and tittle. This has never been the true position of Judaism. So yes, the agenda of many of these people who are opposed to making any such change is first and foremost an ideological one, and not based on any halachic argumentation or any objective analysis of the facts on the ground.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.